What happens when your country is sandwiched between Russia and the rest of Europe for 1,000 years? You get a place that's been the absolute crossroads of history. Imagine living on a piece of land so strategically located that everyone from Vikings to Napoleonic armies, and even Soviet and Nazi powers, has fought tooth and nail to claim it. That place exists, and it's called Belarus. So our journey begins literally at the dawn of human history. Believe it or not, the first settlements in this region date back between 40,000 and 100,000 years ago. But the real story begins after thousands of years, past the Bronze and Iron Ages. Because around the 6th to 8th centuries AD, East Slavic tribes began to settle here, replacing the older cultures and eventually forming the first political groups. By the 9th century, we get the first real written records of a powerful centre, the Polotsk Duchy. Think of Polotsk as the first real capital of this area. It sat right on key river basins like the Dnieper, Dvina, and Pripyat, which were super important for early trade. The Polotsk Duchy held its own until the 13th century, which is when things got really interesting and really big. Because after the Mongol invasion of 1240 dissolved the first major East Slavic state, Kievan Rus, the territory of modern Belarus, was gradually absorbed into the massive Grand Duchy of Lithuania, Rus and Samogitsia. It covered most of modern-day Belarus and huge parts of Ukraine and Western Russia, stretching from the Baltic Sea all the way to the Black Sea. It was a powerful state, and it was during this time that the Belarusian language and national identity really began to form. Then, in 1569, that huge duchy decided to officially team up with the Kingdom of Poland. They signed the Union of Lublin, creating a giant federation known as the Rzeczpospolita, also known as the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. This meant a new era, but unfortunately, it was a very turbulent one, because being part of this giant union meant being dragged into long, exhausting wars across Europe and with Russia. These conflicts, specifically the war with Russia from 1654 to 1667, weakened the state bit by bit. The Rzeczpospolita's struggles came to a head in the late 18th century. In a series of events known as the Partitions of Poland, the neighbouring powers of Russia, Austria, and Prussia divided the state among themselves. And just like that, the land of Belarus became part of the vast Russian Empire starting in 1772. Over the next century and a half, Belarus was a backdrop for massive conflicts. Remember your history lesson where Napoleon invaded Russia in 1812? His troops marched right through here. We also saw major peasant revolts against Russian rule, like the Great Rebellion in the 1860s. These revolts, led by figures like Kastus Kalinowski, show you that even under a massive empire, the people's desire for their own identity and rights never truly died. Then came the 20th century, and with it, 2 world wars that absolutely devastated the land. World War I saw bloody battles between German and Russian forces right across Belarusian territory. But the war also brought a moment of hope, because in 1918, during the chaos of the Russian Revolution, the Belarusian People's Republic declared independence. It was short-lived, however, as German forces occupied it, followed by the Bolsheviks, who eventually created the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic, or BSSR for short, in 1919. But the fighting wasn't over. The Russo-Polish War that followed resulted in the 1921 Riga Peace Treaty, which literally partitioned Belarus between the Soviet Union and Poland. Just imagine your country being cut in half. Although their darkest chapter began in 1941 with the start of World War II, which the Soviets called the Great Patriotic War. German forces occupied Belarus, and what followed was an absolute nightmare. The city of Brest resisted for 6 brutal weeks, and the invaders established a new order based on terror, including the infamous Minsk ghetto, where mass executions took place. The casualties were staggering. It's estimated that the death toll was about 1/4 of the entire population of Soviet Belarus. But out of that darkness came light, because Belarus became home to the largest partisan movement in Europe before 1944. These were brave underground fighters who relentlessly fought the Nazi forces. And it was this intense, devastating struggle that earned Belarus its seat as an independent member of the United Nations in 1945, even though it was still a Soviet republic. So, The Soviet era continued, but a new kind of struggle emerged: Russification. This was a policy in the 1960s that pushed the Belarusian language and culture into the background in favour of Russian. Then, in 1986, came an entirely new kind of disaster. Chernobyl, the nuclear reactor explosion in neighbouring Ukraine, contaminated about 1/5 of Belarus's agricultural land. And with an impact so big, the consequences, both environmental and health-related, are still being dealt with today. But fast forward to 1990, the BSSR adopted the Declaration of State Sovereignty. And on August 25, 1991, Belarus officially proclaimed its independence. The country's name was officially changed to the Republic of Belarus. 3 years later, in 1994, the first presidential election was held, and Alexander Lukashenko was elected. He's been the president ever since, and we'll talk more about the politics later. But for now, let's swap the battlefield for the wetlands and find out what makes Belarus's landscape so unique. So, where exactly is Belarus? It sits right in the middle of major routes, acting like a huge trade bridge between Western Europe and Russia and its neighbours. It's the key intersection where 5 other countries meet: Russia to the northeast, Ukraine to the south, Poland to the west, and Lithuania and Latvia to the northwest. And that central position, pressed up against both powerful Russian and EU countries, is exactly why it's been so fought over throughout history. Which brings us to our next question: how big is Belarus? Well, it covers a total land area of about 207,600 square kilometres, or roughly 80,155 square miles. And inside you'll find mostly flat terrain, thanks to the last ice age. The highest spot, known as Dzierżynskaya Hara, is only 345 metres, or 1,132 feet high, which is hardly Mount Everest. But what sets it apart is that it's covered in beautiful forests, which provided perfect cover for those brave partisan fighters we mentioned earlier. The landscape is also home to some really distinct zones too. So, just to give you a quick rundown. In the south, you have the Belarusian Politia, a massive region of lowlands, marshes, and peat bogs. These vast, difficult marshes acted as a natural barrier, or a highway, for armies throughout history. Then, up in the northwest, there's the Niemen Basin. Here you'll find the Niemen River, which flows all the way to the Baltic Sea, and this basin is a key area for agriculture, especially for growing crops like potatoes, flax, and grains. It's also where you'll find Lake Narak, the largest lake in Belarus. Because despite being landlocked, Belarus has a ton of water. I'm talking about thousands of small streams and over 10,000 small lakes. The most important river is the mighty Dnieper, which flows south toward the Black Sea. And here's a cool fact: the low hills actually split the country's rivers into 2 main groups, one flowing to the Black Sea and the other to the Baltic Sea. But besides this wonderful nature, there's one city in particular that deserves the spotlight. And that's none other than Minsk. It sits right in the centre, and it's the place that truly ties everything together. After its near-complete destruction during World War II, it was almost entirely rebuilt into the modern city you see today. It's the administrative and economic engine, and it's huge. Over 1.99 million people live here. That's about 1/5 of the entire population. Which brings us to our next topic: politics and economy. Remember how intense Belarus's history was, and how we talked about its central location? Well, all that drama leads us right into the heart of the country today. How it's governed and how it keeps the lights on. And trust me, it's going to be intense. Okay, if you're talking about politics in Belarus, you have to start and end with one guy: Alexander Lukashenko. I mentioned him earlier, and he's basically been the main boss since 1994, which was 31 years ago. So how does he stay in power for so long? The biggest reason he stays in power is simple. He has the powerful ability to shut down any trouble, which we call his repressive capacity. After a huge wave of protests in 2020, this power became his most important tool. He has total control over the main security agency, which actually still uses the old Soviet name, the KGB. As long as the boss and his top security allies stick together and stay loyal, it's almost impossible for protests to succeed. And they all depend on Lukashenko for their powerful jobs and wealth, so staying loyal is definitely to their advantage. Meanwhile, the people who oppose him are mostly outside of Belarus now, struggling to keep their influence going back home. But holding on to power requires more than just loyalty, and for that, we need to switch gears and talk about the money. The economy of Belarus is fascinating because it's still built on a lot of Soviet-era ideas. Officially, the country's GDP was valued around $75.96 billion in 2024. But some economists think the true size is actually much bigger, maybe up to $364 billion, because so much money changes hands through the informal economy, which they estimate is about 35% of all economic activity. So what's running the show? Well, the government mostly. Unlike its neighbours, Belarus didn't sell off many state businesses, so state-owned companies are still the kings of the economy. But lately, due to Western sanctions, the government has been going back to very old-school, Soviet ways. Take the price controls, for instance. To fight rising costs, the government started telling businesses how much they could charge. This caused weird problems, because in 2025, potatoes, which were a staple ingredient, almost vanished from the stores. Why? Because the government capped the price at about $0.30 to $0.50 per kilogram for local sales. The farmers simply decided to export their potatoes to Russia, where they could sell them for nearly 3 times more. It just makes business sense. They've also told banks they must increase lending for investment by a huge 16% in 2025, which is called directed lending, forcing banks to lend even when it doesn't make commercial sense. But the biggest economic fact is this: Belarus is deeply reliant on Russia, meaning the country's factories survive by selling things to Russia. Back in 2020, about 45% of its exports went there, but after 2020, that share exploded. And by 2023, Russia was buying around 70% of all Belarus foreign trade, and for exports specifically, it was over 90%. They also get massive financial help from Russia, including huge energy subsidies, for things like super cheap gas and oil. And this financial aid is enormous, swinging between 10% and 20% of Belarus's entire GDP. Even with the huge cost of the government's old-school policies, the economy actually grew by a good 3.9% in 2023, thanks to Russia stepping in to offset the sanctions. But things are slowing down. In early 2025, the growth rate dipped to 3%, and prices are going up too, with inflation hitting 6.9% in May 2025, and as of August 2025, it's hit 7.20%. So that's the system, a powerful leader and a Soviet-inspired economy. But the real story is how the incredible culture of the Belarusian people manages to thrive right in the middle of it. For centuries, the Belarusian people were under outside control, from Polish-Lithuanian rulers to Tsarist Russia, and finally the Soviet Union. So it would have been easy for their unique identity to just disappear, but the Belarusian people fought hard to keep their culture alive. And that spirit of preserving their distinct culture was even celebrated in 2022 when activist Alex Bialyatsky won the Nobel Peace Prize for championing Belarusian literature and identity. Which is quite a big deal. But let's backtrack for a bit and get a feel of what daily life is like. Well, a fun and popular tradition is spending summers at dachas or country cottages where they grow their own food. And get this, mushroom picking is still an incredibly popular social custom. Then, when it comes to food, the undisputed hero of Belarusian cuisine is the potato. Seriously, it's everywhere. You'll find it in potato dumplings, potato pancakes, and baked potato pie. But besides those, other hearty meals include borscht or beet soup and pork stew. When it comes to drinks, the locals love kvass, which is made from fermented bread, but the classic alcoholic drink is definitely vodka, though beer is catching on with younger folks. Okay, enough about the food. Now let's talk about the arts. This country's artistic history is ancient, because if you look at architecture, the oldest surviving building is the 11th century Cathedral of St. Sophia. But with so much of the capital destroyed in World War II, most of Minsk today is built in that grand, imposing Stalinist style from the Soviet rebuilding. In literature, the history is just as cool. Way back in the 16th century, a guy named Francisc Skorina became a historical rock star by translating the Bible and publishing the first printed books in all of Eastern Europe. And get this connection. The northern town of Vitebsk is the birthplace of one of the world's most famous painters, Marc Chagall. You know, the genius behind the painting titled I and the Village. But if you're more into the performing arts, it's pretty huge here too. In fact, it's said that most people in Belarus can play at least one musical instrument. Can you believe that? And the biggest music event is the International Arts Festival, Slavic Bazaar, in Vitebsk, which brings in performers from all over the world. They also have an active theatre scene, with everything from puppet shows to opera. So when you put it all together, you see a people who have kept their identity, their love of art, and their resilience against enormous odds. Which is why I want to know, if you had the chance to explore their culture, would you rather look at the wonderful paintings and architecture scattered all around, or spend an entire week at the Slavic Bazaar in Vitebsk, dancing to music? Share your thoughts in the comments section below. And as always, if you enjoyed this video, you'll love this next one.